The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Hi, I'm Scott Benton, and today we're going to talk with James Welch, the author of Killing Custer, a personal experience regarding the Battle of the Little Bighorn, the history of the Western Indian conflict with the United States Army, and the Indian culture today, as it is perceived looking backward to that dramatic moment on the Little Bighorn when the hunter-gatherer era of the Indians of North American continent ended. Welcome.
Thank you.
Delighted you're here. And I thought we might start out by taking a look at some of the larger questions implicit in revisiting the Bighorn. Why do you think the Indian side of the story has not been as fully known?
Well, I think it's pretty much axiomatic that the victor always writes the history of a particular era, and even though the Indians won at Little Bighorn, it was their last victory, at least for the Northern Plains Indians, and within a year they were all on reservations, with the exception of Sitting Bull's band, which went to Canada for 4 years. And so the white people eventually triumphed and eventually wrote the history of the period.
Was there an early history from the Indian standpoint back, let's say, in the late 19th century? Did any Indian scholar come along and begin to tell that story?
Not really. I think most of them occurred in the 20th century, after the turn of the century, and certainly not written by any Indian scholars, written by white men who were told, they had interviewed the survivors at that time, who were then probably men in their 60s, 70s, 80s. And they, 2 or 3 of them wrote accounts of the battle from the point of view of the Indians, but quite often the accounts were romantic, they weren't very accurate, and they weren't very well documented. So most people tended to either dismiss them or take them with a grain of salt.
Some people might consider this revisionist history. And we've talked a little bit about that this is filling in a gap, but I wish you'd comment on that.
Yeah, I really consider it more to be a history written not only from the traditional historical side, but also from the side that really hasn't been heard from much, but has a very legitimate place in the history of that period. You know, you can look at one group of people, for instance, the Indian people, and you can say, okay, I'm going to write your history now, as I perceive it, or as we perceive it from our point of view. What I try to do is to be right with the Indian people and write it from that particular viewpoint, and it's very legitimate. You know, there are accounts which can be documented, and so their side, the Indian side of the story, is interesting and can be quite legitimate.
I'm struck when you talk about the differing ways of viewing the same thing from the Indian side and from the Yankee side, or however you want to characterize it. And I don't know which Indian chief this was, but they had asked him, how long did the main fight take with Custer? And from the Army side, it was the battle commenced at 12:15 and ended at 1:45 or whatever it happened to be. And his comment was, not having a watch and not caring a darn about watches, I presume, that it took about as long as it takes an average guy to eat his dinner.
Yeah.
Which, to me, was a very neat way of phrasing the Indian reality.
Yeah, there was quite a difference. That was Two Moons, a Cheyenne war chief, who said it took about as long as it takes for a hungry man to eat his dinner. Another participant said it took about as long as it takes for the sun to travel the width of a lodgepole. Yeah, time for Indians was very metaphorical and based on events and the time to water the horses or turn them out or something. So yeah, they didn't have that notion of time as these minute units and all the variations on that.
One of the things that struck me, the first time that I got caught up, I think, in the drama of the Little Bighorn was reading Cyrus Townsend Brady. He wrote a series of popular Indian fights and fighters from a very biased standpoint. Although he'd put the facts down. His conclusions would be suspect today, but the facts were generally correct. And then shortly after I read that, I saw Errol Flynn in They Died with Their Boots On. Now, the central image of that is Errol Flynn standing alone at the end, surrounded by hundreds of whooping warriors, shooting with his six-shooter bravely until the moment of the final death. And at no time in that movie, I think Anthony Quinn played Crazy Horse, if I'm not mistaken, and he was a good heavy. He could be a menace, and he was always perceived as a menace in this thing. Never once did that film or Cyrus Townsend Brady or any of the early events get into the fact that these people were sitting in a village not doing anything belligerent, having a social moment together, and not planning on moving on the army or moving on the local settlements. They just were out for a good buffalo hunt and a last hoorah. And that, to me, is very, very touching and also makes me, let's say, culturally, if not ashamed, certainly uncomfortable with the way we've treated the event. You do a moment that is, I think, based on your skill as a novelist, setting the scene, standing at the moment now when you visited the site of that village and just describing it, how it looked now, and imagining almost poetically what it was at that past moment.
Yeah, I tried in the book. I tried to portray the village as it was 3 miles long, and it was populated by human beings, and so I compare it somewhat to a big campground, and try to think of people doing arts and crafts, making a bow and arrow, or tanning a hide, or drying meat, cutting meat into strips to dry on racks. The children be out playing. The girls would be playing with either dolls or hoops and sticks, and the boys would be shooting bows and arrows. Young men would be courting young women, and mothers would be telling stories to their children. Old ones would. So I tried to portray this as kind of a big camp full of human beings who are very peaceful. It's a very peaceful moment, and it was. The day got up to be 100 degrees. But at that moment, under the shade of the cottonwood trees with the river rushing by, it was a very peaceful moment. And then an old man starts crying out, soldiers are here, soldiers are here. Young men go out and fight them, and you hear these bullets whizzing by, like, as one man describes it, like angry bees. And just the terror that this village must have felt as they came under attack must have been just immense for the women, the children, the old ones, and I try to portray that moment in the novel, in the book.
Looking back on the history that immediately preceded that in the Plains Wars, thinking about, I'm going to pronounce the name wrong probably. Is it Washita or Washita?
I've always said Washita.
Okay, I'll go with Washita.
Okay.
It sounds better to me anyway, for some reason or other. But in that battle in 1868, Custer attacked a village in the winter, and women and children were killed deliberately. That was well known to the Indians. And in fact, that wasn't the only incident of its kind. The Sand Creek Massacre and others were a Holocaustian approach to settling the Indian problem. That was well known to the people there on the Bighorn?
Yes, it was
Widely
pretty well
known?
known. The Washita was well known, which occurred in 1868. The massacre at Sand Creek, which I believe was 1864. Incidentally, both those events involved the same Indians, the same Southern Cheyennes. And so the people up north knew about these events. They knew about the massacre on the Marias River, which happened in 1870, which is what I describe in the book to actually begin the book, because it happened to my own people, the Blackfeet, and which 173 Indian people, men, women, and children, were killed. So they were well aware of this idea of removing the Indians from this country by any means possible, even if it meant slaughtering them. I mean, even if it meant genocide. It was estimated that in the mid-19th century, there were like 5 million Indian people in the contiguous United States area. By 1900, there were 238,000 Indians left. So I don't
that
think
in North America?
in the United States part of North
Okay.
America. So it becomes clear a lot of them died of diseases that they weren't prepared for, especially smallpox. But also they were wiped out. It wasn't beyond any stretch of imagination to believe that a policy of genocide, even if it was unspoken, was part of the overall strategy to remove Indians.
There's Phil Sheridan, who was the general in charge of that area, the Civil War hero, apparently had a policy that was strike them in the winter when they were holed up and in their camps, and then you could get them all at once rather than have to chase them around when they can get on horseback and get away from you, which seemed to me to be a pretty cold-blooded assessment of trying to resolve a cultural conflict.
Yeah, he did have that policy, and it worked. You know, it was a terrific policy as military strategy, because the Indians didn't expect attacks in the wintertime. They were bundled up in their camps. Previous to that, the Army always tried to attack them in the spring, summer, or fall when the weather was good, and the Indians were very mobile, and so they could never quite have this big confrontation that they always sought. And so when Custer attacked the Southern Cheyenne people at the Washita, he was the first practitioner of Sheridan's theory that in the wintertime the Indians would be bundled up, and it worked perfectly.
And yet here at the Bighorn, it's in June, but with 3 columns moving towards this grand convocation of Indians and catching them. Did they have a sense? Did they know that was the last moment because the buffalo was vanishing and so forth?
Yes, they really did. When Sitting Bull issued his invitation for all the Indians to come and join them, and especially the reservation Indians. Some Indians have been on reservations for 8 years already. And he said, come on out, we'll all get together, we'll have a good time. And some accounts say that we'll have one last big fight with the whites too. But people just came, and even at the time of the battle on June 25th, Indians were still arriving from the reservations. So everybody responded, and it made for a huge village. And I think their main goal was to get together, to have, as you say, this convocation, this grand reunion, to hunt buffalo, to just live in the old way, because Sitting Bull and the other leaders knew that that way was just about over.
So there was a great poignance then, a sense poignance that the sun was setting on that part of their existence, and the young people had no place to go if they weren't going to be able to embrace the old culture. They were faced with not just an unknown future, but a bleak future. How did the Indians at that time feel about life on a reservation?
Well, life on a reservation was just horrible. This was during Grant's administration, and there was much corruption during that administration. Indian agents, suppliers, even people as far up as the Seward. He was in Grant's cabinet. Grant's brother Orville was involved in this corruption, in which everybody got kickbacks, and one of the things was they sold supplies to other people rather than the Indians. They would get the supplies and sell them elsewhere. So to the Indians, rations were always in short supply, and most of the time when they did get through, they were unfit to eat. So consequently, Indians just starved to death on these reservations. It was a very awful period in American history.
There was another simple kind of logic that seems to have been defied in looking at Dakota. We all know that if you farm Dakota, you better have a ton of land and grow wheat or some other grain. And yet the Indians on the Standing Rock and Pine Ridge were told, here's 160 acres and turn it into a truck farm. Now, you can make some excuse, I suppose, for the fact that they were just learning about the realities of living on the high plains. But the Indians had lived there for a long time, and even though they were hunters and gatherers, they also had some crops. But how familiar were they? Were they making the turn into an agricultural life?
No, they weren't. That was the farthest thing from their mind, agriculture, except for some of the people like the Mandans and the Arikaras and some of the people who lived in the Missouri River Valley permanently. But most, as you say, most of them were hunters, gatherers. Some people call them nomads or roamers. They did plant crops in certain places, like they would plant a tobacco crop and go away, and then they'd come back and harvest the tobacco. But it was just a little plot for personal or ceremonial use. So when they were given the 160 acres under the Dawes Act, they were given shovels, they were given hard-toed shoes, and told to go out and plant a crop. And you know, they didn't know how to do it. 160 acres, as you say, wasn't nearly enough land, so they were destined to fail. And when they failed, people said it was because they were lazy, they didn't care, and so on. So the stereotypes kicked in then, and just tarred them with this brush that said they weren't real Americans, they couldn't make it.
There's a personal question about the fact, now you were raised up on a Blackfoot reservation?
The Blackfeet.
Blackfeet, excuse me.
Right.
I'll get the hang of it in a minute.
Right.
And they would show movies. At Browning, Montana, is that it?
Mm-hmm.
There had to be a theater there then. And you would see They Died with Their Boots On, or you name the Western, where the tall Gary Cooper rides in, or Randolph Scott, and the bad guy is very usually played by an Italian actor, by the way,
Yeah.
Joseph Calia, or any one of a number of Italian actors.
Mature.
Yes, and or Leo Carrillo, or I'm thinking, well, you name it, of guys that made a living playing Indians, and nobody ever bothered to ask the Indians, who turned out to be very good actors too. And we just found that out in the last 10 years.
Uh-huh.
But here would be a bunch of Indian kids, let's say on Saturday afternoon in a movie theater, watching something where very clearly the stereotypes were carefully drawn. There were the good guys, and they wore hats and they had spurs and they had saddles, and they were going west. And there were those guys lurking around in the bushes that didn't wear very good clothes, and they weren't very well armed, and somehow or other they were very menacing. Now, what happened in that theater among those kids in terms of relating or not relating to those movies? Because that was about all they were, by the way. I'm describing a typical film, I think.
Yes. Well, this was in the late 40s, very early 50s, and the settlers would be under attack by a large horde of savages, and I'll put quotes on that. And the savages are shooting flaming arrows into the house, and the family is singing a hymn, their last hymn before the end. And you hear the faint notes of a bugle, and you hear some thundering hoofbeats, and pretty soon you see the cavalry coming, and they're riding at breakneck speed, and all the people in the audience would cheer. And as I mentioned in the book, it was only when the lights came up and you looked around, you realized that these were all Indian faces cheering the cavalry, which was coming to punish the Indians in the movie.
They understood the drama, but not the history.
No, the consciousness hadn't been raised at that particular time.
The central figure that we saw on saloon posters and in movies and in stories for these many years, or over 120 years almost now, is George Armstrong Custer, who was very much a creature of the period. But what do you think? What were the forces that made George Custer what he was?
Well, I think that he is a more complicated man than people give him credit for. I don't think he is purely a hero. I don't think he is purely a fool. Somewhere in between there.
How about villain?
A villain? Yeah, well, he was certainly a villain to Indian people. When he led the expedition into the Black Hills in 1874, the Indians called that the Thieves' Trail, and Custer the King of the Thieves. So the Indians had no use at all for him. So to Indian people, yes, he was the villain. I don't know, in a psychological way, I mean, if one were to analyze Custer, I suppose you'd find a person who was ambitious, who was probably insecure. When he was young, when he was a child, he was raised by his mother and then an aunt. They used to dress him in dresses, and he would have long golden locks, and I think maybe that kind of followed him around in his adulthood and maybe made him want to prove himself as a man. He was complicated.
Extraordinary story of his wife, who lived on so many years, didn't die till 1933 or 1927, anyway, well into this century, and spent her life apparently throwing roses at his memory and writing books about it, and some of which were bestsellers.
Oh yes, she died with a fortune of $100,000, which was a fortune in those days. She
That
lived
much?
on Park Avenue. On Park Avenue in New York.
And probably idolized socially.
Yes, she was, and her whole purpose for 50 years, she outlived George by 50 years, was to keep his memory green with young people, with generations, so that they would always think of Custer as this great hero. And she succeeded. She, along with Buffalo Bill, who in his Wild West show had a portion devoted to the recreation of the Battle of Little Bighorn. And he played to all the crowned heads of Europe as well as here in the States. So between the two of them, they kept Custer's memory alive, and they really created, along with the poets, the Custer myth.
What influence do you think that battle and its memory has on the Native Americans today?
The battle itself, I think, is kind of a pleasant memory to Indians.
We won one.
Right, yeah, they won one. And but what I noticed in talking to the Indian elders and other people on the various reservations we visited was that they tended to focus more on their losses. The Sioux or Lakota people would focus on the treacherous murders of Crazy Horse and Sitting Bull, and on the massacre at Wounded Knee in 1890. The Northern Cheyenne people focused more on the attack by the Army on Dull Knife's village 6 months after the Battle of the Little Bighorn, in which many people were slaughtered. In the wintertime, many people eventually froze to death or starved to death, and so on. I noticed that these kinds of losses were more significant to the Indians I talked to than this one kind of momentary triumph, which has gone down in white history as something, I think, more elevated than what actually occurred.
There was, as I recall, a lot of recriminations in the Army afterwards between Major Reno, I guess he was to the court-martial, Captain Benteen, who was no fan of Colonel Custer. There's a confusion, I think, too, about Custer, and that he's called general, but it was a brevet rank. He lost that after the Civil War. He was a lieutenant colonel, and the colonel of the regiment wasn't present. I don't know where he was, but it seems to me he ran the regiment, and the colonel was elsewhere. And not everybody was massacred. There were 600 and some odd people, which was an understrength regiment. I think there were 1,000 people, I think, would be a regiment, and that was probably typical for Western soldiers at that point. And yet only 218 or some, rather one-third.
260 some.
Okay.
Altogether.
So there was a third or maybe a bit more were actually killed, and the rest of them survived.
Mm-hmm. Well, also, here's another point that most people don't realize. When they say there were no survivors of the Custer Battle, and when they're talking about the Custer Battle, they're talking about Custer's companies, not Reno's or Benteen's. But I like to point out that there were probably 8,000 survivors. On the other side, the Indians survived. Only between 60 and 100 Indians got killed. So I think it's important, again, to strike this balance between the two sides and to remember that the Indians fought there too, and that many of them survived to tell their stories to their children, and so on. It's important to realize there were two sides.
To me, there's a parallel here. Most Americans now consider the Civil War as our conflict, and they regard with a certain amount of affection both sides of that conflict. Robert E. Lee is also an American hero. I think perhaps we're beginning to come to that point with the war with the Plains Indians, and that the Sitting Bulls and the Crazy Horses and people of that ilk are now beginning to be embraced by the American consciousness as our American heroes. And whether there was a difference of opinion at the time, that was their problem. Now we can look at them correctly and assess them correctly. We've been talking with James Welch, author of Killing Custer, an extremely interesting and very readable story of the Battle of Little Bighorn and its impact on the Indian culture and our perception of that great conflict with the Plains Indians of 70, 80, 100 and some odd years ago. I think Wounded Knee was...
20 years.
Yeah, okay. It is doing very well, I'm told, in the bookstores, and I can see why. I enjoyed it, and so will you.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.